Section 57 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. All About Coffee by William Ukers. The History of Coffee in Literature. Part 6. Will's Coffee House, the predecessor of Button's, and even more celebrated than that coffee house, was kept by William Irwin. It first had the title of the Red Cow, then of the Rose, and, we believe, is the same house alluded to in the pleasant story in the second number of the Tatler, "Supper and friends expect we at the Rose." Dean Lockyer has left this lifelike picture of his interview with the presiding genius, Dryden, at Will's. "I was about 17 when I first came up to town," says the dean, "an odd-looking boy, with short rough hair, and that sort of awkwardness which one always brings up at first out of the country with one. However, in spite of my bashfulness and appearance, I used, now and then, to thrust myself into Will's to have the pleasure of seeing the most celebrated wits of that time, who then resorted thither. The second time that ever I was there, Mr. Dryden was speaking of his own things, as he frequently did, especially of such as had been lately published. 'If anything of mine is good,' says he, ''tis Macflecknoe, and I value myself the more upon it, because it is the first piece of ridicule written in heroics.' On hearing this, I plucked up my spirits so far as to say, in a voice but just loud enough to be heard, that Macflecknoe was a very fine poem, but that I had not imagined it to be the first that was ever writ that way. On this, Dryden turned short upon me, as surprised at my interposing, asked me how long I had been a dealer in poetry, and added with a smile, 'Pray, sir, what is it that you did imagine to have been writ so before?' I named Boileau's Lutrin and Tassoni's Secchia Rapita, which I had read, and knew Dryden had borrowed some strokes from each. ''Tis true,' said Dryden, 'I had forgot them.' A little after, Dryden went out, and in going, spoke to me again, and desired me to come and see him the next day. I was highly delighted with the invitation, went to see him accordingly, and was well acquainted with him after as long as he lived. Will's Coffee House was the open market for libels and lampoons, the latter named from the established burden formerly sung to them. Lampone, lampone, camarada lampone. There was a drunken fellow named Julian, who was a characterless frequenter of Will's, and Sir Walter Scott has given this account of him and his vocation. Upon the general practice of writing lampoons, and the necessity of finding some mode of dispersing them, which should diffuse the scandal widely while the authors remained concealed, was founded the self-erected office of Julian, secretary, as he called himself, to the Muses. This person attended Will's, the wits' coffee house, as it was called, and dispersed among the crowds who frequented that place of gay resort copies of the lampoons which had been privately communicated to him by their authors. He is described, says Mr. Malone, as a very drunken fellow, and at one time was confined for a libel. Tom Brown describes a wit and a beau set up with little or no expense, a pair of red stockings and a sword knot set up one, and peeping once a day in at Will's, and 2 or 3 second-hand sayings the other. Pepys one night, going to fetch home his wife, stopped in Covent Garden, at the great coffee house there, as he called Will's, where he never was before. Where, he adds, Dryden the poet I knew at Cambridge, and all the wits of the town, and Harris the player, and Mr. Hoole of our college. And had I had time then, or could at other times, it will be good coming thither, for there, I perceive, is very witty and pleasant discourse. but I could not tarry, and as it was late, they were all ready to go away. Addison passed each day alike, and much in the manner that Dryden did. Dryden employed his mornings in writing, dined en famille, and then went to Will's, only he came home earlier o' nights. Pope, when very young, was impressed with such veneration for Dryden that he persuaded some friends to take him to Will's coffee house, and was delighted that he could say that he had seen Dryden. Sir Charles Wogan, too, brought up Pope from the Forest of Windsor to dress à la mode and introduce at Will's coffee house. Pope afterwards described Dryden as a plump man with a down look, and not very conversable; and Cibber could tell no more, but that he remembered him a decent old man, arbiter of critical disputes at Will's. Prior sings of the younger Styles, whom Dryden pedagogues at Will's. Most of the hostile criticism on his plays, which Dryden has noticed in his various prefaces, appear to have been made at his favourite haunt, Will's coffee house. Dryden is generally said to have been returning from Will's to his house in Gerrard Street, when he was cudgelled in Rose Street by 3 persons, hired for the purpose by Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, in the winter of 1679. The assault, or the Rose Alley ambuscade, certainly took place, but it is not so certain that Dryden was on his way from Will's, and he then lived in Long Acre, not Gerrard Street. It is worthy of remark that Swift was accustomed to speak disparagingly of Will's, as in his Rhapsody on Poetry: "Be sure at Will's the following day, lie snug and hear what critics say; and if you find the general vogue pronounces you a stupid rogue, damns all your thoughts as low and little, sit still and swallow down your spittle." Swift thought little of the frequenters of Will's. He used to say the worst conversation he ever heard in his life was at Will's coffee house, where the wits, as they were called, used formerly to assemble; that is to say, 5 or 6 men who had writ plays, or at least prologues, or had a share in a miscellany, came thither, and entertained one another with their trifling composures, in so important an air, as if they had been the noblest efforts of human nature, or that the fate of kingdoms depended on them. In the first number of the Tatler, poetry is promised under the article of Will's coffee house. The place, however, changed after Dryden's time. You used to see songs, epigrams, and satires in the hands of every man you met. You have now only a pack of cards, and instead of the cavils about the turn of the expression, the elegance of the style, and the like, the learned now dispute only about the truth of the game. In old times we used to sit upon a play here after it was acted, but now the entertainment's turned another way. The spectator is sometimes seen thrusting his head into a round of politicians at Will's, and listening with great attention to the narratives that are made in these little circular audiences. Then we have as an instance of no one member of human society but that would have some little pretension for some degree in it, like him who came to Will's coffee house upon the merit of having writ a posy of a ring. And Robin, the porter who waits at Will's, is the best man in town for carrying a billet. The fellow has a thin body, swift step, demure looks, sufficient sense, and knows the town. After Dryden's death in 1701, Will's continued for about 10 years to be still the wits' coffee house, as we see by Ned Ward's account, and by the Journey through England in 1722. Pope entered with keen relish into society, and courted the correspondence of the town wits and coffee house critics. Among his early friends was Mr. Henry Cromwell, one of the cousinry of the Protector's family. He was a bachelor, and spent most of his time in London. He had some pretensions to scholarship and literature, having translated several of Ovid's elegies for Tonson's Miscellany. With Wycherley, Gay, Dennis, the popular actors and actresses of the day, and with all the frequenters of Will's, Cromwell was familiar. He had done more than take a pinch out of Dryden's snuff box, which was a point of high ambition and honour at Will's. He had quarrelled with him about a frail poetess, Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas, whom Dryden had christened Corinna, and who was also known as Sappho. Gay characterized this literary and eccentric beau as "honest, hatless Cromwell, with red breeches," it being his custom to carry his hat in his hand when walking with ladies. What with ladies and literature, rehearsals and reviews, and critical attention to the quality of his coffee and Brazil snuff, Henry Cromwell's time was fully occupied in town. Cromwell was a dangerous acquaintance for Pope at the age of 16 or 17, but he was a very agreeable one. Most of Pope's letters to his friends are addressed to him at the Blue Hall in Great Wyld Street, near Drury Lane, and others to Widow Hambledon's coffee house at the end of Prince's Street, near Drury Lane, London. Cromwell made one visit to Binfield. On his return to London, Pope wrote to him, referring to the ladies in particular, and to his favourite coffee. Will's was the great resort for the wits of Dryden's time, after whose death it was transferred to Button's. Pope describes the houses as opposite each other in Russell Street, Covent Garden, where Addison established Daniel Button in a new house about 1712. And his fame after the production of Cato drew many of the Whigs thither. Button had been servant to the Countess of Warwick. The house is more correctly described as over against Tom's, near the middle of the south side of the street. Addison was the great patron of Button's, but it is said that when he suffered any vexation from his countess, he withdrew from Button's house. His chief companions before he married Lady Warwick were Steele, Budgell, Phillips, Carey, Davenant, and Colonel Brett. He used to breakfast with one or other of them in St. James's Place, dine at taverns with them, then to Button's, and then to some tavern again, for supper in the evening. And this was the usual round of his life, as Pope tells us in Spenser's Anecdotes, where Pope also says, Addison usually studied all the morning, then met his party at Button's, dined there, and stayed 5 or 6 hours, and sometimes far into the night. I was of the company for about a year, but found it too much for me. It hurt my health, and so I quitted it. Again, there had been a coldness between me and Mr. Addison for some time, and we had not been in company together for a good while anywhere but at Button's coffee house, where I used to see him almost every day. Here Pope is reported to have said of Patrick the lexicographer that a dictionary maker might know the meaning of one word, but not of two put together. Button's was the receiving house for contributions to the Guardian, for which purpose was put up a lion's head letter box, in imitation of the celebrated lion at Venice, as humorously announced, thus: N.B. Mr. Ironside has, within 5 weeks last past, muzzled 3 lions, gorged 5, and killed 1. On Monday next the skin of the dead one will be hung up in terrorem at Button's coffee house. I intend to publish once every week the roarings of the lion, and hope to make him roar so loud as to be heard over all the British nation. I have, I know not how, been drawn into tattle of myself, more majorum, almost the length of a whole guardian. I shall therefore fill up the remaining part of it with what still relates to my own person and my correspondence. Now I would have them all know that on the 20th instant it is my intention to erect a lion's head, in imitation of those I have described in Venice, through which all the private commonwealth is said to pass. This head is to open a most wide and voracious mouth, which shall take in such letters and papers as are conveyed to me by my correspondents, it being my resolution to have a particular regard to all such matters as come to my hands through the mouth of the lion. There will be under it a box, of which the key will be in my own custody, to receive such papers as are dropped into it. Whatever the lion swallows, I shall digest for the use of the public. This head requires some time to finish, the workmen being resolved to give it several masterly touches, and to represent it as ravenous as possible. It will be set up in Button's coffee house in Covent Garden, who is directed to show the way to the lion's head, and to instruct any young author how to convey his works into the mouth of it with safety and secrecy. I think myself obliged to acquaint the public that the lion's head, of which I advertised them about a fortnight ago, is now erected at Button's Coffee House, in Russell Street, Covent Garden, where it opens its mouth at all hours for the reception of such intelligence as shall be thrown into it. It is reckoned an excellent piece of workmanship, and was designed by a great hand in imitation of the antique Egyptian lion, the face of it being compounded out of that of a lion and a wizard. The features are strong and well furrowed. The whiskers are admired by all that have seen them. It is planted on the western side of the coffee house, holding its paws under the chin upon a box, which contains everything that he swallows. He is indeed a proper emblem of knowledge and action, being all head and paws. Being obliged at present to attend a particular affair of my own, I do empower my printer to look into the arcana of the lion, and select out of them such as may be of public utility; and Mr. Button is hereby authorized and commanded to give my said printer free ingress and egress to the lion without any hindrance, let, or molestation whatsoever, until such time as he shall receive orders to the contrary. And for so doing, this shall be his warrant. My lion, whose jaws are at all times open to intelligence, informs me that there are a few enormous weapons still in being, but that they are to be met with only in gaming houses and some of the obscure retreats of lovers in and about Drury Lane and Covent Garden. This memorable lion's head was tolerably well carved. Through the mouth the letters were dropped into a till at Button's, and beneath were inscribed these two lines from Martial: Servantur magnis isti cervicibus unguis, non nisi delecta pascitur ill fera. The head was designed by Hogarth, and is etched in Ireland's illustrations. Lord Chesterfield is said to have once offered for the head 50 guineas. From Button's it was removed to the Shakespeare's Head Tavern, under the piazza, kept by a person named Tomkins, and in 1751 was for a short time placed in the Bedford Coffee House, immediately adjoining the Shakespeare, and there employed as a letter box by Dr. John Hill for his inspector. In 1769 Tomkins was succeeded by his waiter, Campbell, as proprietor of the tavern and Lion's Head, and by him the latter was retained until November 8th, 1804. when it was purchased by Mr. Charles Richardson, of Richardson's Hotel, for £17 10s., who also possessed the original sign of the Shakespeare's head. After Mr. Richardson's death in 1827, the lion's head devolved to his son, of whom it was bought by the Duke of Bedford and deposited at Woburn Abbey, where it still remains. Pope was subjected to much annoyance and insult at Buttons. Sir Samuel Garth wrote to Gay that everybody was pleased with Pope's translation, but a few at Buttons, to which Gay adds to Pope, "I am confirmed that at Buttons your character is made very free with, as to morals, etc." Cibber, in a letter to Pope, says, "When you used to pass your hours at Buttons, you were even there remarkable for your satirical itch of provocation. Scarce was there a gentleman of any pretension to wit, whom your unguarded temper had not fallen upon in some biting epigram, among which you once caught a pastoral Tartar, whose resentment, that your punishment might be proportionate to the smart of your poetry, had stuck up a birchen rod in the room to be ready whenever you might come within reach of it. And at this rate you writ and rallied and writ on, till you rhymed yourself quite out of the coffee house. The pastoral Tartar was Ambrose Philips, who, says Johnson, hung up a rod at Buttons, with which he threatened to chastise Pope." Pope, in a letter to Craggs, thus explains the affair: "Mr. Philips did express himself with much indignation against me one evening at Buttons' coffee house, as I was told, saying that I was entered into a cabal with Dean Swift and others, to write against the Whig interest, and in particular to undermine his own reputation and that of his friends Steele and Addison. But Mr. Philips never opened his lips to my face, on this or any like occasion, though I was almost every night in the same room with him, nor ever offered me any indecorum. Mr. Addison came to me a night or two after Philips had talked in this idle manner, and assured me of his disbelief of what had been said, of the friendship we should always maintain, and desired I would say nothing further of it. My Lord Halifax did me the honour to stir in this matter, by speaking to several people to obviate a false aspersion, which might have done me no small prejudice with one party. However, Philips did all he could secretly to continue to report with the Hanover Club, and kept in his hands the subscriptions paid for me to him, as secretary to that club. The heads of it have since given him to understand that they take it ill. But upon the terms I ought to be with such a man, I would not ask him for this money, but commissioned one of the players, his equals, to receive it. This is the whole matter. But as to the secret grounds of this malignity, they will make a very pleasant history when we meet." Another account says that the rod was hung up at the bar of Buttons, and that Pope avoided it by remaining at home, his usual custom. Philips was known for his courage and superior dexterity with the sword. He afterwards became justice of the peace, and used to mention Pope, whenever he could get a man in authority to listen to him, as an enemy to the government. At Buttons, the leading company, particularly Addison and Steele, met in large flowing flaxen wigs. Sir Godfrey Kneller, too, was a frequenter. The master died in 1731, when in the Daily Advertiser, October 5th, appeared the following: "On Sunday morning died, after 3 days' illness, Mr. Button, who formerly kept Button's Coffee House in Russell Street, Covent Garden, a very noted house for wits, being the place where the Lion produced the famous Tatlers and Spectators, written by the late Mr. Secretary Addison and Sir Richard Steele, Knight, which works will transmit their names with honor to posterity. Among other wits who frequented Button's were Swift, Arbuthnot, Savage, Budgell, Martin Folkes, and Doctors Garth and Armstrong. In 1720, Hogarth mentions 4 drawings in Indian ink of the characters at Button's coffee house. In these were sketches of Arbuthnot, Addison, Pope, as it is conjectured, and a certain Count Viviani, identified years afterwards by Horace Walpole, when the drawings came under his notice. They subsequently came into Ireland's possession. Jemmy Maclean, or Maclean, the fashionable highwayman, was a frequent visitor at Button's. Mr. John Taylor, of the Sun newspaper, describes Maclean as a tall, showy, good-looking man. A Mr. Donaldson told Taylor that, observing Maclean paid particular attention to the barmaid of the coffee house, the daughter of the landlord, he gave a hint to the father of Maclean's dubious character. The father cautioned the daughter against the highwayman's addresses, and imprudently told her by whose advice he put her on her guard. She as imprudently told Maclean. The next time Donaldson visited the coffee room, and sitting in one of the boxes, Maclean entered, and in a loud tone said, "Mr. Donaldson, I wish to spake to you in a private room." Mr. D., being unarmed and naturally afraid of being alone with such a man, said in answer, that as nothing could pass between them that he did not wish the whole world to know, he begged leave to decline the invitation. "Very well," said Maclean as he left the room, "we shall meet again." A day or two after, as Mr. Donaldson was walking near Richmond in the evening, he saw Maclean on horseback. But fortunately at that moment a gentleman's carriage appeared in view. When Maclean immediately turned his horse towards the carriage, and Donaldson hurried into the protection of Richmond as fast as he could. But for the appearance of the carriage, which presented better prey, it is possible that Maclean would have shot Mr. Donaldson immediately. Maclean's father was an Irish dean. His brother was a Calvinist minister in great esteem at The Hague. Maclean himself had been a grocer in Welbeck Street, but losing a wife that he loved extremely, and by whom he had one little girl, he quitted his business with £200 in his pockets, which he soon spent, and then took to the road with only one companion, Plunkett, a journeyman apothecary. Maclean was taken in the autumn of 1750 by selling a laced waistcoat to a pawnbroker in Monmouth Street, who happened to carry it to the very man who had just sold the lace. Maclean impeached his companion Plunkett, but was not taken. The former got into verse. Gray, in his long story, sings, "A sudden fit of ague shook him, he stood as mute as poor Maclean." Button's subsequently became a private house, and here Mrs. Inchbald lodged, probably after the death of her sister, for whose support she practiced such noble and generous self-denial. Mrs. Inchbald's income was now £172 a year, and we are told that she now went to reside in a boarding house, where she enjoyed more of the comforts of life. Phillips, the publisher, offered her £1,000 for her memoirs, which she declined. She died in a boarding house at Kensington on the 1st of August, 1821, leaving about £6,000 judiciously divided amongst her relatives. Her simple and parsimonious habits were very strange. "Last Thursday," she writes, "I finished scouring my bedroom, while a coach with a coronet and 2 footmen waited at my door to take me an airing." One of the most agreeable memories connected with buttons, says Leigh Hunt, is that of Garth, a man whom, for the sprightliness and generosity of his nature, it is a pleasure to name. He was one of the most amiable and intelligent of a most amiable and intelligent class of men, the physicians. It was just after Queen Anne's accession that Swift made acquaintance with the leaders of the wits at buttons. Ambrose Philips refers to him as the strange clergyman whom the frequenters of the coffee house had observed for some days. He knew no one knew him. He would lay his hat down on a table and walk up and down at a brisk pace for half an hour without speaking to anyone, or seeming to pay attention to anything that was going forward. Then he would snatch up his hat, pay his money at the bar, and walk off without having opened his lips. The frequenters of the room had christened him the Mad Parson. One evening, as Mr. Addison and the rest were observing him, they saw him cast his eyes several times upon a gentleman in boots, who seemed to be just come out of the country. At last Swift advanced towards this bucolic gentleman, as if intending to address him. They were all eager to hear what the dumb parson had to say, and immediately quitted their seats to get near him. Swift went up to the country gentleman, and in a very abrupt manner, without any previous salute, asked him, "Pray, sir, do you know any good weather in the world?" After staring a little at the singularity of Swift's manner and the oddity of the question, the gentleman answered, "Yes, sir, I thank God I remember a great deal of good weather in my time." "That is more," replied Swift, "than I can say. I never remember any weather that was not too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry. But however God Almighty contrives it, at the end of the year 'tis all very well." Sir Walter Scott gives, upon the authority of Dr. Wall of Worcester, who had it from Dr. Arbuthnot himself, the following anecdote, less coarse than the version generally told. Swift was seated by the fire at buttons. There was sand on the floor of the coffee room, and Arbuthnot, with a design to play upon this original figure, offered him a letter which he had just been addressing, saying at the same time, "There, sand that." "I have got no sand," answered Swift, "but I can help you to a little gravel." This he said so significantly that Arbuthnot hastily snatched back his letter to save it from the fate of the capital of Lilliput. Tom's Coffee House in Birchin Lane, Cornhill, though in the main a mercantile resort, acquired some celebrity from its having been frequented by Garrick, who, to keep up an interest in the city, appeared here about twice in a winter at change time, when it was the rendezvous of young merchants. Hawkins says, "After all that has been said of Mr. Garrick, envy must own that he owed his celebrity to his merit, and yet of that himself so diffident, that he practised sundry little but innocent arts to ensure the favor of the public. Yet he did more. When a rising actor complained to Mrs. Garrick that the newspapers abused him, the widow replied, 'You should write your own criticisms. David always did.' One evening Murphy was at Tom's, when Colley Cibber was playing at whist, with an old general for his partner. As the cards were dealt to him, he took up every one in turn, and expressed his disappointment at each indifferent one. In the progress of the game he did not follow suit, and his partner said, 'What, have you not a spade, Mr. Cibber?' The latter, looking at his cards, answered, 'Oh yes, 1,000,' which drew a very peevish comment from the general. On which Cibber, who was shockingly addicted to swearing, replied, 'Don't be angry, for I can play 10 times worse if I like.'" Section 57.